I looked my son in the eye across the kitchen table and told him the one lie I swore I'd never tell him, that I had nothing left. My hands actually shook when I said it, and that part wasn't an act. I told him the pension fund had collapsed. The medical bills from your mother's illness had eaten through everything else, and the bank was 2 weeks from taking the house. I waited. I waited for him to reach over and grab my arm and tell me we'd figure it out together, the way I'd taught him to say it since he was 7 years old. Instead, my son Bradley leaned back in his chair, exhaled like a man setting down a heavy suitcase, and said, "About time. Not, 'I'm sorry.' Not, 'What happened?' Just those 2 words, delivered with a kind of relief I will never forget as long as I live. What Bradley didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that I wasn't broke at all. My accounts were exactly where I'd left them, sitting quiet and untouched in a trust his own lawyer couldn't find with a warrant. The whole collapse, the tears, the trembling hands, all of it was a test. A cruel one, maybe. But I needed to know the truth about the boy I raised before it was too late to do anything about it. And the truth, when it finally came, was worse than anything I could have invented. My name is Walter Prescott. I'm 68 years old, and I live in a farmhouse outside a small town in the hill country of central Texas, the same land my father worked and his father worked before him. I didn't inherit money. I inherited dirt, debt, and a stubborn refusal to quit, and I built a mid-sized construction and land development company out of that dirt over 41 years, one contract at a time, until I could finally stop counting pennies. I never wanted to be a rich man who acted rich. I drove the same truck for 14 years. I wore boots until the soles gave out. My wife Carol used to tease me that I'd sooner spend $100 on a good pair of pliers than on a nice dinner, and she wasn't wrong. Carol passed 4 years ago this spring, breast cancer, and since she left this earth, the house has felt like a museum. Nobody visits. We had one child, our son, Bradley. He's 38 now, married to a woman named Kristen, 34, and the two of them live 40 minutes away in a gated community with a house I helped pay for, and cars I helped pay for, and a lifestyle that, if you peeled back the surface even a little, was propped up entirely by me. For years I told myself I was being a good father. Bradley's restaurant venture failed. I covered the lease. His investment in some friend's tech startup evaporated. I wrote the check and never mentioned it again. Kristen wanted a wedding at a vineyard in Napa that cost more than I made my first 10 years in business, and I paid for that too, smiling the whole time, because that's what a father does, isn't it? He clears the path. He removes the rocks. I believed, deep in my bones, that if I gave my son enough of a soft landing, he would eventually stand up on his own and thank me for it. But somewhere along the way, the requests stopped being requests. They became expectations. And then, this past year, they became something closer to demands, delivered with an edge I didn't recognize in the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in this very kitchen. It started small. Bradley began stopping by more often, always with Kristen trailing behind him, and they'd wander through the house like appraisers, running their fingers along the mantel, commenting on how this place could really be something with the right renovations. Kristen once asked me, straight-faced over coffee, whether I'd thought about simplifying my life now that I was getting older. Bradley started calling the farmhouse an awful lot of house for one man. He'd say things like, "Dad, you know Mom would want you to be comfortable, not rattling around out here alone," as if comfort and control were the same word. The disrespect crept in sideways, in sighs and eye rolls and a creeping tone that suggested I was an inconvenience, standing between my son and something he felt he was owed. I started to wonder, quietly, painfully, whether Bradley loved me at all, or whether he loved the version of me that kept a checkbook open and asked no questions. I needed to know, so I built a test, and God forgive me, I built it well. I invited Bradley and Kristen out to the Arrives on a Sunday evening, told them I had something serious to discuss. I spent the afternoon preparing like an actor, before a performance I never wanted to give. I didn't shave. I wore an old flannel shirt with a tear at the elbow that Carol used to beg me to throw away. I let my shoulders slump when I walked, let my hands tremble when I poured the coffee. When they sat down at my kitchen table, I told them the market had wiped out my retirement accounts, that a bad turn in a land deal had left me holding debt I couldn't cover, that I was going to have to sell the farmhouse and everything on it just to stay out of serious financial trouble. I told them I needed help. I told them I didn't know what I was going to do. Kristen's expression flickered, just for a second, something unreadable crossing her face before she caught herself. Bradley set down his coffee cup very slowly and looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a comforting one. A slow, satisfied smile that spread across his face like he'd just watched a long-running bet finally pay off. He leaned back in his chair, let out that breath, and said, "About time." I asked him what on earth he meant by that. He shrugged, like the question bored him. "Do you have any idea how long we've been waiting for you to finally deal with this place, Dad? You've been sitting on land worth a fortune, refusing to do anything with it, acting like you're going to live forever. Selling it is honestly the best thing that could happen to everybody." Kristen chimed in right behind him, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't match her eyes. "It really is for the best, Walter. You shouldn't be managing all this on your own at your age anyway. This is such a relief." I sat there with my chest caving in, staring at my only child, the boy I taught to bait a hook and check the oil, and shake a man's hand like he meant it. And I could not find a single word to say. Bradley stood up, tossed his napkin on the table like he was closing a business meeting, and told me not to be dramatic, that I'd had a good run, that it was time to face reality and let him handle things. He didn't ask where I would live. He didn't offer me a room in his house. He told me he'd bring paperwork by within the week, and walked out the door with Kristen close behind, the two of them practically floating with excitement. They didn't even bother to hide until they were in the car. I sat alone at that kitchen table until the coffee went cold, and the light outside turned from orange to gray to black, and something in me that had been hoping against hope finally, quietly, died. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Carol's old rocking chair by the window and stared out at the land I'd spent my whole life building, and I let myself finally admit what I'd been too afraid to say out loud for years. I hadn't raised a good man. I had raised an entitled one, and I had done it with my own two hands, one bailout at a time. Carol had warned me. I remembered her voice clear as a bell, from back when Bradley was 17 and had wrecked the truck I bought him because he was showing off for a girl. She told me, "Walter, if you keep cleaning up every mess he makes, he is never going to learn there's a cost to anything." I told her he was just a kid, that kids make mistakes, that I'd rather give him a soft landing than let him suffer the way I did growing up with nothing. I grew up sharing one pair of work boots with my brother. I swore my son would never know that kind of want. And so I built him a life with no consequences in it at all. And now, sitting alone in the dark, I understood exactly what I had built instead. A man who saw me not as his father, but as a resource he was entitled to and tired of waiting on. By the time the sun came up, something in my grief had hardened into something else entirely. I still felt the loss like a knife in my chest, but underneath it was a colder, clearer resolve. If my son wanted to see how far he could push a broken old man, I intended to find out exactly how far he was willing to go. The next morning, I went down to the kitchen early to make coffee, moving quiet out of old habit, and I heard voices on the back porch. Bradley's voice, low and urgent, the kind of tone he never used with me. I froze by the pantry door and listened. He was on the phone, pacing, and through the gap in the screen door I caught every word with a clarity that turned my blood to ice. "He bought it completely," Bradley was saying. "Cried right there at the table. Thinks he's bankrupt. This could not have gone smoother." My stomach dropped, but it was what came next that nearly took my legs out from under me. "I've got a buyer already lined up. A commercial group, they want the whole 70 acres for a distribution center. I'll get him to sign the land over to me for next to nothing. Tell him it's the only way to save him from the debt, and then I flip it to them for the real number. Full price. He'll never see it coming." There was a pause, and then Bradley laughed. A laugh I did not recognize as belonging to my son at all. "Don't worry about the old man. Once the deed's in my name, I've got a doctor lined up who'll say the stress caused early cognitive decline. I'll get power of attorney inside a month. We put him in a care facility, a cheap one, and Kristen and I finally get to breathe." I stood there in my own kitchen with my hand pressed over my mouth, tears burning down my face, listening to my son plan to steal my land, my legacy, and my mind, in that order, without a shred of hesitation in his voice. The grief that had been sitting in my chest all night evaporated in an instant, replaced by something colder and far more useful. Bradley thought he was talking to a broken old fool who'd handed him a fortune on a silver platter. He had no idea that the buyer he was so excited about, the commercial group circling my land, was a company I happened to own the controlling interest in myself, through a holding entity Bradley had never once bothered to look up. He was trying to sell my land back to me. My own son was about to hand me the very rope he intended to hang me with, I want you to understand something about that morning. Whoever is listening to this and nodding along because you've lived some version of it yourself. The moment I heard my son plan my erasure like it was a line item on a spreadsheet, the last soft place in my heart for him closed over like a wound sealing shut. I did not feel rage first. I felt something quieter and far more dangerous. I felt clarity. Over the following days, I played my part like my life depended on it, because in a very real sense, it did. I let my hands shake a little more each time Bradley visited. I let my sentences trail off mid-thought. I agreed, weakly and gratefully, when he told me a family friend in Austin had offered to buy the land for a fraction of its worth, just enough to cover my fictional debts and save me from ruin. I nodded along when Kristen started bringing over little glasses of some homemade tonic she swore would help with my nerves. Chamomile and root extracts, she said. Good for an anxious heart. I drank the first one out of politeness before I noticed the strange, bitter aftertaste sitting under the mint, and something old and cautious in me, some instinct sharpened by 40 years of reading dishonest men across a negotiating table, told me not to trust it. I poured the second glass down the bathroom sink when she wasn't looking, and pretended to grow groggier by the evening anyway, slurring my words a little, letting my eyelids droop, watching her watch me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. I drove into Austin the next morning before either of them woke, telling no one where I was going. I had a longtime friend, a private lab technician I'd used decades earlier during a nasty contract dispute, run a sample of what was left in that glass. 48 hours later, he called me back, sounding grim. It was a low-grade sedative compound, the kind that in small, repeated doses could cause tremors, confusion, and memory lapses that would look, to an untrained doctor, exactly like the onset of dementia. My daughter-in-law was not soothing my nerves. She was manufacturing the exact medical excuse my son needed to have me declared incompetent. I called my attorney and oldest friend, a sharp, unshakable man named Russell Ford, who had handled my company's legal affairs since before Bradley was born, and I told him everything, start to finish, my voice steady even though my hands were not. Russell went quiet on the line for a long moment, and when he spoke again there was a fury in his voice I had never heard from him in 30 years of friendship. He told me he'd start building the paper trail immediately. I also hired a private investigator, a retired state trooper named Gary Holt, and told him to dig into every corner of Bradley's finances, because a man that desperate to steal from his own father usually has a reason that has nothing to do with greed alone and everything to do with fear. Gary called me 2 days later with an answer that explained everything. Bradley wasn't just entitled. He was drowning. He'd been secretly running up enormous losses, trading options, and had borrowed heavily, off the books, from a private lender connected to some very unpleasant people out of Houston, the kind of men who don't send lawyers when payments are late, they send other kinds of visitors. Bradley owed nearly $2 million, with a deadline closing in fast, and he had decided the fastest way out of that hole was to sell his own father's land out from under him and disappear before anyone asked too many questions about where the money went. I sat with that for a long while. Understanding why a man does something monstrous does not make the thing less monstrous, but it does tell you exactly where to aim. I had Russell quietly and legally purchase Bradley's entire debt from that private lender through an anonymous shell entity, paying the full amount plus a premium those men were more than happy to accept in exchange for simply walking away and signing the ledger over. From that moment forward, the dangerous men chasing my son had no reason to touch him at all, because his debt now belonged entirely to me. Bradley didn't know it yet, but the very people he feared most had already been paid off by the man he was trying to destroy. I also had 2 small recording devices installed, one beneath the guest bedroom nightstand where Bradley and Kristen stayed on their visits, and one tucked inside the console of Bradley's truck, which he never bothered to lock, because he'd never once imagined his own father capable of outsmarting him. What I heard over the following nights confirmed everything and then some. I heard Kristen complaining that the sedative dosage wasn't working fast enough, that I was still walking around too clear-headed for a man losing his mind. I heard Bradley reassure her that the doctor was already paid $15,000 in cash and would declare me incompetent the moment the land transfer was signed. I heard him say with a coldness that still visits me in my sleep, once he's in that facility, he won't even remember he had a son. I recorded every word. I filed every document. I let Friday arrive exactly on schedule, the day Bradley had chosen for me to sign the transfer papers, because I wanted him standing in my kitchen, pen in his hand, victory already lighting up his face, when the truth finally came down on him like a roof caving in. That morning, Bradley arrived with a leather folder full of documents and a notary he'd hired. A nervous young man who clearly had no idea what he'd stumbled into. Kristen stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me with barely concealed impatience as Bradley slid the papers across my kitchen table and placed a pen in my trembling hand, telling me gently, almost tenderly, that this was the last hard thing I'd ever have to do, that everything would be easier once it was over. I let my hand shake against the paper exactly the way I'd been practicing for 2 weeks. I let the silence stretch out just long enough for him to lean forward, hungry for it, and then I set the pen down, sat up straight in my chair, and let every ounce of the tired old man I'd been pretending to be simply fall away. "That tonic your wife's been making has a strange aftertaste, Bradley," I said, my voice steady and clear for the first time in weeks. "You might want to tell her to use a little more sugar next time." The color drained out of both their faces at once. Kristen's mouth fell open. Bradley just stared at me, his confidence cracking wide open like a windshield taking a rock straight to the glass. "What did you just say?" he managed. I reached into the drawer beneath the table where I'd hidden a thick folder for exactly this moment and set it down on top of his precious transfer papers. "I'm saying I know exactly what's in that tonic, and I know exactly how much money you owe, and I know exactly what you and your wife have been planning to do to me." I told him, plainly, that the buyer he was so excited about, the commercial group ready to pay full price for my land, was a company I controlled myself, that he'd been trying to sell my land back to my own pocket the entire time. I watched something break behind his eyes as the scale of it landed on him all at once. Before he could gather himself enough to speak, the front door opened without a knock, and Russell walked in, followed by 2 county sheriff's deputies. I'd asked him to arrange in advance, holding a warrant built entirely from the recordings, the toxicology report, and the financial trail Gary had assembled. Kristen let out a short, sharp cry and backed against the wall. Bradley just stood there frozen, his mouth opening and closing with no words coming out, looking, for the first time since he was a boy, genuinely afraid of me. "Dad," he finally said, his voice cracking into something small and childlike. "Please, you have to stop this. I'll fix it. Just tell them it's a misunderstanding." I looked at my son, this grown man standing in the kitchen where I once taught him to tie his shoes, and I felt the last thread of obligation between us go quiet inside my chest. "You made your choice the morning you decided to drug your own father and steal his land," I told him. "I'm not going to make it for you now." The deputies led them both out to the driveway in handcuffs while the notary sat frozen at my table, white as a bedsheet, clutching his briefcase like it might protect him. The months that followed were a blur of hearings, depositions, and long, silent drives to the county courthouse. The recordings were damning beyond dispute. The toxicology report left no room for doubt. Bradley eventually took a plea deal that kept him out of a life sentence, but still sent him away for 9 years on charges of elder financial exploitation and criminal conspiracy. Kristen took a separate deal for her role in the poisoning and got 6 years of her own. I sat in the front row of that courtroom every single day in a pressed shirt, my hands steady, and I did not look away once, not even when Bradley finally turned around and tried to catch my eye like he used to when he was small and wanted forgiveness for something minor. There was nothing minor about this, and there was no forgiveness sitting in me to give him, not that day. I still live out on the farmland, same as always. The silence doesn't feel quite as heavy as it once did, because I filled it with something better than fear. I set up a foundation in Carol's name that helps older folks across 3 counties recognize the warning signs of exactly what happened to me: financial isolation, sudden wellness routines pushed by family members, pressure to sign documents quickly. I've spoken to more than a few of them personally, sitting across kitchen tables not so different from mine, telling them what I wish somebody had told me years ago, that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just a door left open for anyone willing to walk through it and take what they want. I think about Bradley sometimes, late at night, the boy he used to be before the man he became took over. I loved that boy with everything I had, and giving him everything I had is exactly what turned him into someone capable of what he did. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. Not the betrayal itself, but the understanding that I built the conditions for it, one convenient check at a time. If there's one thing I'd want to say to anyone listening to this who sees even a shadow of their own family in this story, it's this. Protecting the people you love does not mean removing every consequence from their path. Sometimes the kindest, hardest thing a parent can do is let a child stand on their own 2 feet, even if it means watching them stumble. Because the alternative, the thing I lived through, is watching them grow so comfortable standing on your back that they forget you're a person underneath them at all. I'm 68 years old, and I have never felt more clear-eyed about what family actually requires from us. Not blind loyalty, not silent money, just the truth, spoken honestly, even when it costs you everything to say it out loud.